Courtroom was already silent before Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hale even entered the building. Federal trials involving former military contractors always attracted attention, especially this one. News reporters crowded the courthouse steps before sunrise, while armed marshals guarded every hallway inside. Marcus ignored all of it. The retired Navy SEAL walked through security with the calm expression of someone who had spent most of his life controlling fear long before other people noticed it existed. Beside him moved Atlas, a massive black Belgian Malinois, wearing an old tactical harness faded from years of deployments overseas. Most people in the courthouse assumed the dog was there for emotional support or ceremonial protection. They were wrong. Atlas had served beside Marcus through counter-terror operations for nearly 6 years and survived missions most soldiers refused discussing afterward. The dog wasn't decoration. He was instinct wrapped in muscle and memory. And on the morning, Marcus arrived ready to testify against a private defense network. Accused of illegal overseas operations, Atlas behaved strangely from the moment they entered the courthouse. The Malinois ignored reporters, ignored crowded elevators, ignored armed deputies, until they stepped inside courtroom 4B. Then the dog suddenly froze. Marcus noticed immediately because Atlas never hesitated entering unfamiliar spaces. But now, every muscle in the canine's body tightened as his eyes locked toward the front of the courtroom, where Judge Harold Brennan quietly reviewed paperwork behind the bench. At first, Marcus assumed the dog simply reacted to movement or tension in the room. Then Atlas growled, low, deep, controlled. Several attorneys turned instantly. One marshal stepped closer nervously, while Marcus tightened his grip on the leash. Atlas, heel. The command barely worked. The dog continued staring directly at the judge without blinking. Judge Brennan finally looked up over his glasses with visible irritation. Control your animal, Commander. Marcus felt coldness crawl slowly through his chest because Atlas was not reacting aggressively. He was reacting the same way he used to during operations overseas whenever hidden threats were nearby. The retired SEAL crouched beside the dog quietly, trying to calm him, but Atlas only became more alert the closer the judge moved. Then something happened Marcus hadn't seen in years. The Malinois stepped protectively in front of him. Not random behavior, trained response, combat response. Every instinct Marcus built through years of warfare switched on instantly. He slowly looked toward Judge Brennan again, and suddenly a memory surfaced from nearly 8 years earlier in Afghanistan. A classified night operation involving missing weapons shipments, corrupted contractor networks, and one American official whose face appeared only briefly during encrypted mission briefings. Marcus hadn't thought about that operation in years because most records connected to it vanished quietly after several men died under suspicious circumstances. But now, staring at the judge across the courtroom, pieces began fitting together in a way that made his blood run cold. Atlas barked once, loud enough to echo through the chamber, and, for the first time since entering the courtroom, Judge Brennan no longer looked annoyed. He looked afraid. Marcus Hale had spent enough years in combat zones to recognize fear when he saw it, especially the kind people try desperately to hide. Judge Brennan recovered quickly after Atlas barked, adjusting his glasses and forcing calm back into his expression, but the moment still unsettled the entire courtroom. Reporters exchanged whispers. Federal marshals shifted closer toward Marcus and the dog. One attorney quietly asked for a recess. Through all of it, Atlas never stopped staring at the judge. The Malinois stood rigid beside the witness stand, ears raised, muscles tense beneath the old tactical harness like he was waiting for a command nobody else could hear. Marcus slowly rested one hand against the dog's neck, trying to steady his own thoughts because something deep in his memory had already started connecting pieces he buried years ago. Afghanistan, Kandahar province, missing military shipments, a sealed operation that ended with 3 SEALs dead and every surviving witness forced into silence afterward. At the time, Marcus believed corruption existed somewhere inside the contractor network they were investigating. But he never imagined it reached inside the American judicial system itself. Judge Brennan cleared his throat sharply and ordered the court back to order, though his voice sounded tighter now. "Commander Hale," he said carefully, "perhaps your dog should be removed before testimony begins." Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he kept watching the judge while old memories resurfaced harder with every passing second. During the final briefing of that forgotten Afghanistan operation, Marcus briefly saw a civilian legal advisor attached to the Oversight Committee reviewing classified transport routes. Young at the time, different haircut, no gray hair yet, but the eyes were the same. Brennan. Back then, he used another surname connected to federal contracting investigations, before later entering the judicial system quietly. Marcus felt his pulse slow in that dangerous way operators know too well. The moment instinct stops feeling like paranoia and starts feeling like certainty. Then Atlas growled again, not toward the bench this time, toward the judge's briefcase, sitting partially open beside his chair. Marcus noticed it instantly. So did one federal marshal standing near the jury box. The deputy frowned slightly while watching the dog's reaction. Atlas stepped forward once, nose lifting toward the scent drifting across the courtroom. Marcus understood immediately because military dogs trained beside explosives and weapons units never fully forget certain smells. Oil, gunpowder, chemical residue. The Malinois had detected something connected to combat environments before. And somehow that scent was coming from the judge's belongings. The courtroom atmosphere shifted dangerously after that. One marshal finally approached the bench cautiously. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "for security reasons, we may need to inspect." Brennan slammed one hand against the desk hard enough to silence the room. Absolutely not. Too fast, too emotional. Every trained person inside the courtroom noticed it immediately. Marcus slowly stood from the witness chair, and Atlas barked again. This time the Malinois lunged directly toward the judge's bench. Marshals reacted instantly, grabbing the leash while attorneys shouted and reporters scattered backward in panic. But Marcus wasn't watching the chaos anymore. He was watching Brennan. Because the judge didn't react like a man startled by a dog. He reacted like a man terrified of being discovered. Then everything broke apart at once. Judge Brennan suddenly reached toward the briefcase. 3 federal marshals drew weapons immediately. "Don't move!" The courtroom exploded into screaming as deputies rushed the bench. Brennan froze only for half a second before attempting to pull something metallic from inside the case. He never got the chance. Marshals slammed him against the courtroom wall, while papers scattered across the floor. Atlas barked violently beneath the chaos while Marcus moved civilians away from the benches on instinct alone. Seconds later, one deputy opened the briefcase carefully. Inside rested a loaded handgun fitted with a suppressor. But that wasn't the worst part. Hidden beneath legal files sat multiple classified photographs connected to the same Afghanistan operation Marcus thought disappeared years ago. Dead contractors, satellite images, names, witnesses, including Marcus himself. The entire courtroom went silent because suddenly this wasn't about a judge carrying a weapon illegally inside federal court. It was about a man who spent years hiding inside the justice system while protecting secrets tied to military corruption and murder. One federal investigator slowly looked toward Marcus after reviewing the photographs. "Commander," he asked quietly, "what exactly were you supposed to testify about today?" Marcus stared at the restrained judge for several long seconds before answering. "Not this." Atlas finally stopped barking after that. The old military dog simply sat beside Marcus again, calm now, like his job was finished. And deep down, every person in that courtroom understood the terrifying truth. If the K9 hadn't reacted when he did, a retired Navy SEAL might never have walked out of courtroom 4B alive. The courthouse remained locked down for nearly 9 hours after Judge Harold Brennan's arrest. Federal agents sealed entire floors, evidence teams carried boxes out through underground exits, and reporters crowded the streets outside trying to understand how a respected federal judge ended up handcuffed inside his own courtroom, but inside a secured witness protection office. 3 floors below the main building, Marcus Hale sat quietly beside Atlas while investigators pieced together a story far darker than anyone expected. The old Belgian Malinois rested calmly near the wall now, exhaustion finally replacing the combat alertness that took over earlier that morning. Every once in a while, the dog lifted his head toward the hallway whenever unfamiliar footsteps approached. But otherwise, he remained still, almost like he understood the danger had finally passed. Marcus, however, knew better. Danger like this never ended quickly. One federal investigator eventually entered the room, carrying a thick classified file marked with military clearance labels from nearly a decade earlier. He placed it carefully on the table before speaking. "Commander Hale, everything connected to Brennan traces back to the Kandahar operation you were involved in." Marcus slowly leaned back in his chair, saying nothing. The investigator continued carefully. According to recovered documents from the briefcase, Brennan wasn't just protecting corrupt contractors. He helped bury evidence tied to illegal weapons transfers, moving through military transport channels overseas. Atlas lifted his head slightly. After hearing the tension rise in the room, the investigator hesitated before adding the part that changed everything. "And based on what we found, someone inside that courtroom planned to make sure you never testified today." Silence settled heavily across the room. Marcus stared toward the table for several long seconds while old memories returned harder than ever. Afghanistan nights filled with dust and rotor noise. Missing teammates. Missions rewritten afterward by officials sitting safely behind desks. For years he convinced himself the operation failed because of corruption, buried deep inside contractor networks. But now he understood. The truth ran much higher. Brennan spent nearly 8 years climbing through the federal system while quietly eliminating records, witnesses, and investigations connected to the operation. Marcus wasn't walking into court to expose a few contractors anymore. He was walking into the final loose end of a cover-up, and Atlas sensed it before anyone else. Later that evening, federal agents reviewed courthouse security footage, frame by frame, trying to reconstruct Brennan's actions before the hearing. What they discovered shocked even veteran investigators. The judge personally disabled secondary courtroom security checks less than an hour before proceedings began. He altered witness placement positions, changed marshal assignments, even delayed one surveillance rotation near the rear courthouse exit. Every detail pointed toward premeditation. Then came the most disturbing discovery. Brennan wasn't acting alone. 3 additional federal employees, tied to evidence handling and judicial transport, disappeared within hours of his arrest. One abandoned vehicle was later recovered near the Virginia state line. Another suspect boarded an international flight minutes before federal warrants activated. Suddenly, the investigation exploded nationwide. News channels called it the largest corruption scandal involving military oversight in decades. Marcus ignored all of it. That night, he sat alone beside Atlas, inside a temporary safe house arranged by federal protection teams. Rain tapped softly against the windows, while the old K9 slept near the fireplace. For the first time all day, silence finally settled around them. Marcus slowly looked toward the dog and shook his head faintly. You knew before I did, didn't you? Atlas opened one eye briefly at the sound of his voice. Marcus smiled tiredly. Years earlier, during deployments overseas, teammates used to joke that Atlas trusted nobody wearing polished shoes. The dog reacted badly around certain officers, contractors, and intelligence personnel long before investigations exposed them later. At the time, everyone laughed about it. But after today, Marcus realized something uncomfortable. Atlas never forgot dangerous people, even after years, especially not men connected to violence. The next morning brought another shock. Federal investigators discovered Brennan's fingerprints inside sealed evidence archives connected to the deaths of 2 SEAL operators from Marcus's original Afghanistan team. Officially, those soldiers died during insurgent attacks overseas. Unofficially, newly uncovered files suggested both men planned to testify about illegal weapons operations shortly before their deaths. Marcus read the reports in silence, then quietly closed the folder, because after years of carrying survivors' guilt, he finally understood something painful. His teammates were never abandoned by accident. They were silenced. And somehow Atlas remembered the scent of the man connected to it all after nearly 8 years apart. 3 weeks later, Judge Brennan officially disappeared from public view after federal prosecutors transferred him into military custody, tied to classified wartime investigations. Most court documents remained sealed from the public permanently. Several names connected to intelligence contracting vanished quietly from government positions soon afterward. And as always happens with stories involving power, corruption, and war, headlines slowly faded. But inside military communities, veterans remembered one detail above everything else. A retired combat dog walked into a courtroom and recognized evil before the justice system did. Months later, Marcus returned to a quieter life along the Oregon coast, where he and Atlas spent mornings walking empty beaches far from cameras and federal agents. The old Malinois moved slower now. Gray fur spread around his muzzle, and arthritis stiffened his legs after years of deployments. But every evening, Atlas still checked windows and doorways before finally settling near Marcus's chair like he had during missions overseas. Some habits never leave working dogs. One rainy afternoon, a young reporter managed to ask Marcus a final question before he disappeared completely from public attention. "Commander Hale, how did your dog know Judge Brennan was dangerous?" Marcus looked down at Atlas resting beside him, then answered softly, "Because soldiers forget faces sometimes." A faint smile crossed his tired expression. "Dogs don't." The reporter never forgot that answer afterward. And honestly, neither did anyone else who heard the story of the Navy SEAL who walked into court ready to testify, only to realize his canine partner had already identified the real threat sitting behind the judge's bench. Some partners protect us in war. Some protect us long after the fighting ends. And sometimes, the instincts we trust least are the very things keeping us alive. If this story touched your heart, stay with us for the next journey, because loyalty remembers what the world tries to hide.